Well, with today being graduation Sunday, I've really been thinking a lot this week about that time in your life when you move on. You know what I'm talking about? Where the page of life turns and next one, you leave behind one stage of life, you move on to something new, maybe something different, something else entirely. You exchange one sphere of influence in your life for another. You move from having one platform you've had maybe for a long time to having a different platform. And whether that's high school and college graduation, or you change jobs, you change careers, you move homes, your places of residence, or maybe it's something else all entirely, every single one of us at some point in life, or maybe even multiple points, experience a time of change like that. And because of the nature of that change, you really can't go back and have everything be the same as it was before. You get one and only one chance, one opportunity, just one, to establish yourself and leave behind whatever legacy you're going to leave behind. And here's the thing about legacies, or even leaving a legacy that no one really wants to acknowledge or talk about, is your legacy and what you leave behind has already begun. Legacy is often associated with death, generally, after you pass on what you leave behind, whether it's money or fame or whatever it is. However, what you leave behind when you die or when you move on from a position or any kind of transition season in life, it doesn't start when the transition happens or when you're already gone. It was happening the entire time. You are already leaving a legacy at work or at school or in the community, within your church, and all of life right now, and everything you do, everything you say, your legacy starts now, or it's already begun, rather. Your legacy is left behind when you move on, but it's established and lived out through you in every single moment you have. The platform you have now, the season of life you're in right now, the sphere of influence you have right now, those are all yours, and you have just one opportunity to leave a legacy that lasts and a legacy that matters for everyone around you. Just one. You can't go back and you can't change anything, but you do have a say in this moment forward how everything's going to play out in front of you. When you graduate high school, you can't go back and change your test grades or change how you even treated your classmates. When you switch jobs, you can't go back and change your performance or how you were perceived by your coworkers. And when you die, well, you can't come back and have a do-over. What you'll discover, however, today is that when you collide with Jesus, you can repurpose your life to change the legacy you leave. You can be more intentional, you can be more wise, more conscious, and maybe even more focused on being the you that God has called you to be, so the legacy you leave does in fact matter and does in fact last. You know, there's many stories in the Bible that deal with change, deal with legacy. There's many people who show these radical transformations are possible. And there's many verses that display uplifting messages about change, but there might possibly be no other verse in the Bible more popular, more recognizable than, well, John 3:16 that Jeff read for us earlier. That sort of encompasses everything that I just talked about. But if I'm honest with you, the message today really didn't start having anything to do with John 3:16, and I've never really seen John 3:16 or even thought about it in the light that I'm going to present it today, if I'm honest with you. So if you would, you can turn over to John chapter 3. It's where we're going to be sort of camped out today. You can scroll over on your digital Bible, however you want to get there. But we're going to be in John chapter 3. And John chapter 3 sort of just kept pulling me in this week. To be honest with you, like I said, it didn't have anything to do with John 3:16. It's really John 3, apart from that, is this story of change. It's a story of repurposing, a character that shows transformation is possible. Leaving a legacy does matter, and you can control it. And it has a character that displays that, and that they change their platform in life to be used for God. John chapter 3 seemingly has everything to do with what we're talking about, and then when I got to John 3:16 in it, my brain exploded a little bit because God sort of opened me up to see it in a different way than, to be honest with you, I'm embarrassed I've never seen it that way before. I mean, I knew John 3:16 like most of us, but to be honest, I'd never really seen it play out quite like this. So I pray today that you get out of this text what I did when it comes to concerning your purpose in life, the legacy you live, and how to live a life for Jesus truly and purposefully. So with that in mind, let's read, starting in verse 1 of John chapter 3, it says this. It says, "Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council." And it goes on to say, "He came to Jesus at night and said, 'Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform these signs you're doing if God were not with him.'" So I'm just going to stop there for a second after the first two verses there. This passage, like I said, includes John 3:16, one of the most popular verses, but that verse itself is rooted in this story of a man named Nicodemus. Now, if you've done any Bible studying in your time, you've probably heard or maybe even come across that name, Nicodemus. He's a fairly well-known character, if you will, in the Bible. He pops up a few times in the book of John. And though he doesn't have a book named after him, and he's not going to get thrown out when you start naming characters like Abraham or Moses or Paul, Nicodemus' story itself is quite significant. In fact, it's within his story that Jesus chooses to say, well, John 3:16. Nicodemus, we learn a few things about him in this passage just right off the bat. In the first verse, we learn he is a Pharisee. He's a Pharisee. And if you know much about Jesus and his ministry, you'll know that Jesus often interacted, we'll call it, with the Pharisees. People like Nicodemus and Nicodemus himself. And let's just say it rarely ended well for the Pharisees, right? Jesus got the best of him from time to time. And nevertheless, Nicodemus was on the receiving end of those debates, those confrontations, because he was a Pharisee. He was a student, he was a scholar, he was a teacher. He understood and he knew the Old Testament very, very well. He understood Jewish traditions, Jewish laws. In other words, he would be what we would probably consider an expert. He was highly intelligent, he was well-versed. He was a smart guy. And we also learn in that same passage that he was a member of the Jewish ruling council, which more than likely means he was a member of what they called the Sanhedrin. And that was the Jewish governing body in Jerusalem at the time. For us today, it's sort of essentially the equivalent of the Supreme Court. So you could say Nicodemus was like a Supreme Court justice. He had a lot of power. He was a big deal. And if anyone had bragging rights, well, it was Nicodemus. And I want you to keep that in mind about his status, his power, all his accomplishments in life, because that's going to come into play very soon. In fact, it's going to come into play almost immediately for Jesus, because in verse 2 it says, he came to Jesus at night and he called him Rabbi. And I want you to know that when he calls Jesus Rabbi, that's by no means disrespectful. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A scholarly expert like Nicodemus, whose people often disagreed and even disliked and tried to kill Jesus, and he acknowledges him, he acknowledges his miracles, his connection with God, and then he gives him a title that's equivalent of his own. He calls him Rabbi. That's a big deal, all things considered. I mean, someone who clashed with this guy just equated him with his own people at the highest level. He basically was going against everything that his people, the Pharisees, stood for. That's a big, big deal. But the question that I have is this one. Why did he go at night? Why? Why did he go at night? Was he sneaking around? Was he afraid the other Pharisees would see him go be with Jesus? Probably. Was he scared anyone at all would see him equate with Jesus? That's probably true. Was he simply up late studying since he was a big scholar? Probably not. But the simple fact is we don't really know for sure, but we can speculate. But based on that, isn't that sort of like our life a little bit? Nicodemus very well could have been worried about jeopardizing his popular reputation, his power, his influence. So he chose, well, I'm going to sneak around and travel at night. Nicodemus was, at the very least, he was seeking out a meeting with Jesus, and then he acknowledged Jesus' miracles, and he even said he admired his teaching. So, in other words, his heart was longing for something his head just couldn't quite understand. And I believe that Nicodemus' heart and his head were sort of at war with one another, right? What he had known and what he wanted to believe, they were sort of raging at battle in his soul. And he went at night, yet he traveled directly toward the light of the world. He was simultaneously drawn to the hope and love of that light and scared of what that light might reveal to be the truth in his life. See, when we come to points like that in life, a job change, a graduation, whatever it is, some kind of transition, leaving behind something for something else, when we come to those points, we're a lot like Nicodemus. Our heart and our head are sort of at war with one another. We're excited about the future, where we're going, but maybe scared, about what we're leaving behind, a little bittersweet. Yet the one thing I think we forget is, like Nicodemus, when you meet Jesus, you really never leave this meeting the same, do you? We could put it this way: colliding with Christ changes you forever. Once you collide with Jesus, you just don't make it out the same. You're shaped, you're molded into someone, into something new with a better purpose. And look what happens to Nicodemus here in verses 3 and 4, if we can pull that up. It says, Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless you're what? Born again." And then he goes on to say this. He says, "How can someone be born again when they're old?" Nicodemus asks. "Surely they can't enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." So one of the most accomplished, one of the most intelligent, capable, competent people on the entire planet at the time, in Nicodemus, is within one sentence immediately confused by Jesus. Being born again? What are you talking about, Jesus? What are you talking about? Babies aren't adults. It's different. We're only born one time. What are you trying to say? Nicodemus really just doesn't have a clue what Jesus is telling him. And you and I, we have the pleasure at this point in knowing what Jesus is referring to. You know, he's referring to being baptized and walking in a new life with him. A life of being baptized into Christ and living transformed. You know, born again is, of course, a popular term we refer to as Christians nowadays. But you got to keep in mind, when Nicodemus has this encounter, he didn't know any of that. He was an Old Testament scholar, but he hadn't met Jesus yet in this way. He doesn't have the knowledge we have, so Jesus hasn't really flipped everything right side up in his life yet. They're sort of still living upside down. And we know this because we can read it in the next couple verses, but for Nicodemus, it's groundbreaking theology. He's about to explain Jesus' the how you have a repurposed life, how you do that. Look at verse 5. Starting in verse 5, Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, Nicodemus, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born of water and the Spirit." And he goes on to say, "Flesh gives birth to flesh, the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You shouldn't be surprised at me saying you must be born again." That's what he's telling Nicodemus. And he goes on, he says, "The wind blows wherever it pleases, you hear the sound, but you can't tell where it's coming from, where it's going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." So Jesus sort of gives the answer to this riddle in Nicodemus' mind. In a quick summary, he basically tells Nicodemus, you shouldn't be surprised by what I'm saying. And he also tells him, he's referring to believers being baptized and walking in a new life, being born again. In other words, it's not just a regular birth, it's a rebirth. Jesus is explaining to Nicodemus what it means to use his position, his power in life, his influence to live for God and bring him glory, to leave a legacy for others that do the same. If you want to do that, Jesus says, well, you got to get baptized into Christ and you got to live a changed life. You're a powerful person, Nicodemus. You've got influence, you've got reputation. You better use it wisely. And for us, it's really the same thing. You got to use your life to bring light into a dark world around you. Whatever you do for a living, whatever circle you hang out in, whatever you say, whatever you do, wherever you go, you get one and only one legacy. So Jesus says you better make it count. Better make it count. In other words, we could put it this way. If you give your life to Christ and you're baptized to walk in a new life with him, everything in your life begins to have a more clear purpose and more clear direction. So if you want purpose and you want direction, Jesus says, come to me. Just come to me. And the funniest thing about all this is if you read the next verse, Nicodemus is still stumped. He says in verse 9, how can this be? In other words, what are you talking about? After all that, Nicodemus still just isn't quite sure what Jesus is really asking him to do. He's almost there, but he hasn't got all the pieces of the puzzle together yet. And look at Jesus' response in 10. I love this. It's so humbling. You're Israel's teacher, Jesus says. So he says, you got a lot of great things about you. But then he says, and you still don't understand these things? Still don't get it? Now, this is where everything really gets pretty good. Verse 10 is sort of this great reminder for us as well. Jesus acknowledges Nicodemus' greatness, his accomplishments. He calls him Israel's teacher. He says, Nicodemus, I know you're a scholar. I know you're a teacher. I know you're an expert on the Jewish law and in the Old Testament. You're a faithful follower of God even. But, even with all that, you don't get it? Not only is that a painful reminder for Nicodemus, but sort of is for us too, isn't it? When you meet, you collide, you converse with Jesus, you got to leave your accomplishments, your accolades, your achievements at the door. Jesus isn't as interested in what you know, what you've accomplished, or who you think you are, as much as he cares about who you actually are, how you can use that for him, and who he knows you have the potential to become. You might think you know yourself well, but I can tell you Jesus knows the real you better than even you do. He knows who you can become even if you're a person who doubts it can happen in your life. Maybe you're a person who has great plans for yourself, but Jesus knows a better blueprint than even you do. Regardless of what end of the spectrum you're on this morning, he knows better. You know, I used to think the old adage was true and sort of live my life that way. One man's trash is another man's treasure. You ever heard that? More accurately in this case, I guess, one man's treasure might as well be, well, trash, right? It's all rubbish. You can just throw it in there, your accomplishments, everything you've earned, everything you've made, right? I can't take those awards. I can't take those accolades, those certificates, the accomplishments. They don't mean anything. They're trash, right? Well, in a sense, that's true. Everything you accomplish does mean nothing if you don't have a relationship with Jesus. It does. Mark 8 puts it in the famous way, what good is it for someone to gain the entire world if they forfeit their soul? And I can answer that for you. It does you no good. You have no gain. You've missed the one thing that matters, and that's a relationship with Jesus. You can leave behind a legacy, but if it has no eternal impact, what good does it do? You can transition to new chapters in life, but if you don't make progress spiritually also, what good does it really do you? In a sense, well, it is all trash in that way. But what I realized is this may not be the entire picture. It may not be the entire picture. Jesus goes on, I'm not going to read all of those in verses 11 through 15 to explain the connection between the Son of Man, the Messiah, to heaven, right? In other words, he's telling Nicodemus without calling himself the Messiah, that he has to have a relationship with him. He has to be born again because his eternity is at stake. That's what he tells Nicodemus. Your entire eternity is at stake if you don't have a relationship with the Son of Man, with Jesus. But then the mic drop moment happens in the next verse from Jesus to Nicodemus, and I'm sure you all know it. We can read it together. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And in that moment, everything changes. Not just for Nicodemus, for all of us. Jesus gives Nicodemus the heart, the center of the gospel message. And from here on out, we don't even see Nicodemus speak anymore. He gets it. After that collision point with Jesus, later on we see that Nicodemus shows fruit of a changed life. He's changed. He gets it. He's not the same as he was before. And Jesus goes on to finish that passage by really digging deep into the gospel, what this life's all about with purpose, what the purpose of it is, what the legacy is you have to leave. And he says, starting in verse 17, for God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, no. He sent him to save the world through him. And he goes on to say, whoever believes is not condemned, but whoever doesn't believe stands condemned because they don't believe in God's one and only Son. And then he just lays it all out and says, this is the verdict. Light's come into the world, but people loved the darkness instead because of the light shows their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light. They're not going to come to the light for fear their deeds, well, they'll be exposed. But then he says, whoever believes and lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be plainly seen what they've done in the sight of God. So the collision happens here. Nicodemus goes for a meeting in the dark with Jesus, and the light hits him so hard that he leaves forever changed. Nicodemus finally gets it, the aha moment. He knows he can use his life for God finally. He knows that his legacy already has begun, and whatever he's doing, whatever he's done, he can use all of that for God. He's got a clear purpose. What he's done, who he is, it matters and can be used regardless if it's bad or regardless if it's good. It can all be used to glorify God. And he can play a part in that. Nicodemus just hasn't been born. He finally gets it. He's been reborn. He doesn't just have a purpose and to leave a legacy. He's now got a repurposed legacy moving forward. He sees the entire picture, which is that Nicodemus doesn't have to think of everything just as trash or as treasure. He can use both the mistakes and the failures in his life as well as his triumphs, his gifts from God, all for God. In other words, it's not one man's trash is another man's treasure, and it's not all we have is trash. Maybe it should look and sound a little bit more like this. A man's trash and a man's treasures all can be used for tools for Jesus. Every bit of it. The good, the bad. You can use everything in your life for God and his glory. Other people can see themselves and their stories in you, in your sin and your failure, as well as admire you for your accomplishments and your choices and your joy and your hope. The good and the bad. Everything changes when you meet Jesus in your life, and your legacy gets repurposed and reshaped. You're on a new path, a better one. And Jesus says, all you got to do is be born again and follow me. That's it. I want you to think about repurposing. That's a good term people use. If you watch any HGTV, people repurpose items. I think we've got a few examples up here. Look at this first one. Someone's taken toilet paper rolls and turned them into storage, organized storage. It's pretty cool. Maybe some of you guys do that. How about this next one up here? Maybe you've seen this one. A broken ladder or an unused ladder and turn it into something like a bookshelf for storage. It's pretty cool. I've seen a few of those before. I've seen just a couple of these, taking an old TV, maybe it doesn't work anymore, turning it into a fish tank. It's pretty cool. Maybe some of you guys have those in your home. I don't know. How about this one? A bathtub, maybe a ceramic bathtub, into a couch. I don't know how comfortable that would be, but it's still pretty cool. Not being used anymore. Might as well turn it into something. Maybe something you guys can relate to is this one. Look at these guys. Turning an old kiddie pool into a boat. They didn't have one. They wanted to go on the river. Right? You might see that here on the west side. I'm not sure. Speaking of west side, maybe something you can relate to. How about this one? A redneck deer stand. Okay, a redneck deer stand. Now, I'm not above using it. I'll be honest. Redneck deer stand, turning an old truck into a deer stand there. How about this one of my favorites? A redneck doorbell. Now, I'm not going to say whose house I took that picture of right there. Those old Budweiser cans, you hear them. Hey, someone's at the door, right? How about this one? A piano bookshelf. Maybe they don't play the piano, it's broken, left at your house, and they turn it into something cool like that. Possibly the neatest of all these is this one. It doesn't appear much there, but what this is a person in a city took all of the trash around town, they collected it, and they turned it and repurposed it into what looks like little dog houses, but what actually is little huts and small homes for the homeless people in their city. Literally taking trash and turning it into something new, repurposing it. See, all of these items, whether they're unused or they're wasted, they're broken, they're unwanted, they've now been repurposed and are part of a new, better mission. They're useful, they're wanted, they're chosen, just like Nicodemus and just like you. Look at the two other interactions we see with Nicodemus in the book of John. Later on in John 7, the chief priests, the Pharisees, Nicodemus' people, they're discussing Jesus. They believe he's deceiving people. But look who steps up to defend him. Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own, asked this. He says in verse 51, if we can go on there, we have that one. Verse 51, what Nicodemus says. He says, does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he's been doing? So Nicodemus, in front of all these people who disagree with Jesus, defends him after he interacts with Jesus. He's changed. Or how about when Jesus is crucified later on in John 19, the disciples scatter everywhere, they're running around, they're scared, and he's laid to rest in the tomb, and Joseph of Arimathea comes to take his body. But who comes with Joseph? Look at John chapter 19, verse 39, it says he was accompanied by who? Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. And he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. So in front of everybody, whereas he was scared to go before at night, in front of everyone he goes to the body of Jesus because he's changed, he believes, and he gets it. Every time we hear of Nicodemus after this collision with Jesus, we see what appears to be a repurposed man. He's got a different mission now. He's figured out what we should figure out, and it's these three things here. Number one is, whatever platform we have, whatever job, whatever career, whatever school you go to, whatever friend group you're in, you can use that for Christ. Number two, you can be an agent for positive change in your life and in the world. You can be literally the light of the world as Jesus calls us to be. You know, I don't have to tell you that we live in a dark world. Just think about this last week in Texas. It's sad. This world needs change. It needs hope. And who better to be the hope and light into that dark world than the Christians, the light of it. And then number three, we can use both our trash and treasures as tools for Jesus, for other people to experience God's love. See, when you figure out who Jesus is in your life, you figure out who you are. And when you figure out who you are, you figure out how you're going to impact and change the world for him. Simple. You know, Paul was repurposed in Acts chapter 9. We know that story. Ruth repurposed in her own book, Ruth. The prodigal son, you've heard that story. The woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery. The centurion was changed. Lepers, the blind, the sick, the paralyzed, and even the dead were repurposed. All people from all different walks of life, regardless of age, regardless of gender or race or background or even belief before they met him. You don't leave the interaction with Jesus the same. You just don't. They become repurposed to have a new legacy that outlasts those to which they leave it to. Sort of like the story of Nicodemus, we're in one of two positions. Either we need to encounter Jesus and become repurposed to leave a legacy that lasts, or we've sort of encountered Jesus, we're on the right path, but we got to figure out how do we use our trash and how do we use our treasures as tools for Jesus. One of two spots. You know the verse, "For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." See, the thing is, God loves you so much. And he wants you so badly that he gave Jesus for you, his only Son. If you believe in him today, it's time to make sure that you're doing what he desired of you. Being born again, walking in a new life, using both your trash and your treasures as tools for him. Truly a repurposed legacy in life. Pray with me.